I've done this talk a few times. In fact, ever since I qualified, actually, I kept being asked to do this talk year on year. And these are sort of the things that people wanted to know about. So what happens when you finish in terms of holiday, maternity, how much are you going to get paid, what hours are you expected to do, what happens about your indemnity, should you do any out of hours, tax, that's a scary thing if you've never had to consider that in the past. Pensions, what about study leave, what are appraisals and all that kind of thing. How do I do a CV? What's a portfolio career? How do I apply for jobs? And that was sort of the main themes that have come up in the past. So we'll kind of make our way through some of those as we go along. In terms of a plan for this afternoon, so first thing I'm going to talk about is your options after VTS. I'm sure most of you have sort of thought about that, be they sort of locuming, salaried jobs, partnerships, all that kind of thing. Then a little bit on how to get the job, and then at 3:30 we'll have a break, and then we'll have some small group discussions. We've got a little talk on new to practice fellowships, which are something that's worth hearing about and potentially applying for. We can talk about those later, and then there'll be a time for questions at the end, and hopefully, as ever, we will finish a bit before 5. So, yeah, so this is just about me. So this is what happened when I finished training. So I'm a bit of an anomaly, really. So I went straight into partnership after finishing training. This is where I work. This is Clare House Surgery in Tiverton. I live in Exeter and was drawn to the surgery firstly because I did my ST3 year there and they offered me a job. And it's where Ed works, so I knew Ed from training, and because I have done a bit of surgery in the past, there's an operating theatre there, and so that was appealing for me, and I really enjoyed my ST3 year. So I did the sort of very odd thing of going straight into partnership, and I would say that that's virtually unheard of. I was sort of lucky enough to attend partner meetings when I was a trainee, so they were pretty open with me about how things work in the practice. So I went along to all of their partners meetings when I was a trainee. So by the end of my ST3 year, I sort of felt like I had a good idea of what was going on, and that it was a practice that I wanted to stay in long term. I started as just doing 6 sessions, so yeah, it went from being sort of a full-time trainee to doing six sessions when I started out, which was a good move. So yeah, a number of other roles have sort of developed as we've gone along. So I am a GPSI, or now it's called GP with extended role in minor surgery. So I do carpal tunnel surgery, skin cancer surgery, and some minor ops. I'm the clinical director of our PCN. I do this job as well, obviously TVD job, and I'm a trainer. And so I've got a fairly varied job. So hopefully I'm fairly well placed to answer questions about any aspect of life after VTS training. So first up, we would talk about being a salaried doctor. So anybody out there, can you think of any pros and cons of being a salaried doctor?
You can't make strategic decisions that will direct the practice in terms of its direction, and you can't contribute, I don't know, actively to the discussions around strategy.
Sure. I think that's true in some places. I think increasingly GP partnerships do listen to their salaried doctors. At our practice, we have a monthly salaried doctor meeting, and then that sort of gets fed directly back into the partnership. So I don't think it's as true as it used to be, that if you're a salaried doctor, you just come in and do your job and then leave. I think there are opportunities at least at some places, to be involved in improving things and making decisions about how things move forward. But it will, as with everything in general practice, it will depend on where you are. So yeah, so that's a potential disadvantage. You might not get listened to as much. Anybody else? Any good things about being salaried?
Your responsibility is limited in a good way. So you just work the hours that you're expected to work. If something goes wrong in the practice, it's not really your responsibility to deal with it. You can just assume that you have a fairly predictable life in that way.
Yeah, sure.
I think you get job security, so you don't need to worry about that. You have a fixed number of sessions, and you have annual leave, sick leave, stuff like that. So it's just a bit more secure.
Yeah, very true.
You would not have to deal with employment relationship issues if there is hiring or firing or those sorts of big calls to make.
That is certainly true. Yeah, you don't have the HR responsibilities that you do as a partner. That's definitely true.
In terms of disadvantage, you have a fixed income, so even if the practice makes more money, I mean, your income still stays fixed, from what I understand.
Yep, that's certainly true. Yep. Cool. Sorry, was someone talking?
Sorry, I was about to ask you, I don't know whether salaried GPs at all are trainers. I don't know whether they do training.
Yep.
Is that a disadvantage? I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can. You don't have to be a partner to be a GP trainer. You have to work a certain number of years before you can, after qualifying, before you can be a trainer. It's between 2 and 3 years. It's changed a little bit. But yeah, there's no reason you can't be a trainer if you're a salaried doctor. Some of your trainers will be salaried doctors, I'm sure. Certainly 2 of the trainers at my practice are not partners. So you've said some of these. So a good thing, regular salary, so you know how much you're getting paid. You get paid holidays. So as a locum, you don't necessarily get paid holidays. You can take holiday when you want, but you don't get paid for it. You will be entitled to maternity leave. So as a locum, if you were to be pregnant and have a baby, you wouldn't be paid any maternity pay. Some people like having a patient list, and in many places, salaried doctors do have their own list. Opportunity to get to know your patients, which is a good part of being a GP. Some practices grant you study leave, so our salaried doctors get a week of study leave every year. And some practices, indemnity is a bit less relevant now, but a lot of practices will sort of pick up any sort of indemnity costs that you incur. In terms of disadvantage, as you said, generally, and this is not always true, but you may earn less than the partners. Not always true, because partners' salaries go up and down. It's a reflection of how the business is doing. So some partnerships can have very good years, and then the next year might be less good, and you might end up earning less than your salaried doctors despite doing more work. So that's something to think about if you went into partnership. You raise, the potential lack of say in how things are going on, and I think certainly that's something that lots of GP partners are really driven by, is the fact that they want a chance to improve things in their practice. And salaried, there's this sort of weird thing of how much should you get paid when you're a salaried doctor, and then you're in this position where you've been a trainee, you get set, you're on a national pay scale, and you come out the end and you suddenly have to negotiate your terms and your salary with a practice manager or a partnership, and they're things that can feel very strange coming out of training. So partnership. Anybody think of any good things about being a partner?
You can change things if you think things can be improved.
You can, very quickly.
You are self-employed and you are your own boss, if you would like to say it that way.
Yeah.
It's a good investment into a property, and when you leave it, you should leave with more money than you put in.
Very true. So yeah, so focusing on that a little bit more. So some partnerships own so not every GP partnership owns their building, but many do. And the NHS pay you rent for your own building, and generally that sort of pays off your mortgage, and by the time you retire you've got a sort of lump sum that you sell to the person who's taking over from you. So it's a bit like having a buy-to-let mortgage essentially, where you may have to take out a loan to buy into the partnership, but then your repayments are covered by the rent that you get from the government. So it's a bit like having a low risk buy-to-let property, and by the time you return, you will have paid off some capital in the building, and you hopefully should have a sort of lump sum to help you in your retirement. So that's certainly an advantage in some partnerships. Anybody else? Any other good things they can think about partnership?
You usually have your own list.
Mm-hmm. Can be good and bad, of course.
You can have your own list.
Yeah.
Usually. Yeah.
It'd be nice it might be nice to kind of know long term that you're working with the same group of people. Like,
yeah.
So you can plan what you want to do in 10 years' time for the business, or if you personally or whatever.
Sure. So that can be good and bad, depending on who you work with, of course. And what about disadvantages? I'm sure you can think of a few of these.
I think you have to deal with all the other stuff apart from the clinical side of things, like CQC and QoF and other staff issues, things like that.
Definitely. Yeah.
You suddenly become responsible for the earnings, and that could be quite a challenging position to be in. With great power comes great responsibility.
Very true. Yeah. So if
much more likely to take your work home with you?
Potentially, personality based, I'm sure. Same as salaried doctors, I think. I think some people take their work home with them and some people don't. I try and keep my
manage staff.
What was that, sorry?
You have to manage staff, like manage the people.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's that can feel like hard work.
You're effectively running a business as well as being a clinician, rather than just focusing on clinical care.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it sort of felt a bit terrifying for me, really, because I've never been trained about how to run a small business, and suddenly I'm own part of a small business, and I sort of felt a bit unprepared for the other bits, but you get used to it. So here we are. So some advantages: lots of decision making. You've got your own patient list, of course. You get to work with your partners, as Lottie said, which can be a really good thing. You get this thing called drawings, so you don't get a salary. So your drawings are a regular income that you get every month, and they're based on the predicted profits of the partnership. So drawings are generally set, and then at the end of every year there may be extra money, in which case you get a payout, or there might not be extra money, and very rarely you might have to put some money back into the business. That's rare. You get paid holidays. You generally do nowadays get maternity leave. Depends on the practice, but you may get study leave. Indemnity is the same. And one of the really good things about partnership, at least in some practices, is that you get a sabbatical. So about every 4 years, I get 16 weeks off in a row, which are paid to do whatever I want with. So that is a massive benefit of working in some partnerships. So if you are thinking about that, do ask and do ask about sabbaticals, because they are great. Disadvantages: lots of decision making, meetings, all that kind of thing. You own your own patients, and obviously that's good and bad. You have to work closely with a bunch of people. It's like being in a marriage. Sometimes it feels like, and I certainly wouldn't have chosen to marry the people that I'm in a partnership with necessarily. They are lovely people, but not my type. You do have a lot of responsibility. You have responsibility for the people you employ, which can feel like a lot. We've got 115 employees working for us at the moment, so that can feel like a lot of responsibility. Sometimes you need to buy in. So as we talked about property and everything, so in order to join a partnership, you may be asked to give a sum of money to an outgoing partner to buy into the business. Normally that's done in the form of a loan, and generally you don't actually have to put any money in. So it's a loan that then gets paid out of your income from the practice. So it sounds scary, but it needn't necessarily be. And then the other thing is that your income is variable. So as a partner, you're self-employed, and depending on how the business is doing, there might be considerable differences on how much you earn year on year. So some people like that because there's the opportunity to make more money, and some people find the prospect of earning less absolutely terrifying and would prefer a sort of steady income where they knew they were. So that's something to think about. These are things that I love about being a partner. So these are a few pictures of things in the last year. So this is when we started out doing COVID vaccines. So there's a picture of me giving a talk to lots of doctors from PCN on the Pfizer vaccine and how to do that, which was quite fun. These are some of our uniforms that we got when we decided that we were scrubs. We just made a decision and we just bought those. These are our nurses doing flu vaccines for a pediatric clinic. You'll be pleased to know, not elderly care or anything like that. That was a peds clinic where they were in obviously superhero stuff, and you can sort of do whatever you want really, because it's up to you. These are some. The bottom is 12-foot Christmas tree that we bought on a sort of whim because we thought it'd be nice for Christmas. Surrounded by boxes which were like Christmas hampers that we bought for our staff, and there's some other stuff that we put in it, so booze basically. And then up on the left is it's actually our accounts meeting from last year, which was because of COVID on Zoom. So it's sort of so different from working in a hospital. And every day is different, and I like the challenge, and I like how I'm never bored, and I don't think as a GP partner you can ever be bored. Locums, right, so many people after they finish training think quite sensibly, I'd like to have a look around and I would like to locum. So pros and cons of locuming, what do people think?
Less admin.
Yep.
Flexibility.
Absolutely.
You don't get continuity with your patients.
Yeah, so that could be a disadvantage or an advantage depending on the patient.
Yeah.
Get to see what lots of practices are like and whether you want to work there maybe long term.
Yeah, sure. So sort of try before you buy kind of thing. If you are thinking of working somewhere, doing some locum shifts there is a good way to sort of work out whether it's somewhere that would fit you. So absolutely. Anybody else?
Better earnings, locum pay rate.
Potentially, yeah.
You can do different things. So I know lots of people have been doing things like the vaccine clinics, or I think some people have been doing out of hours and things as well.
Yeah.
A lot of our locums have always had IT problems every time they come in the morning.
That's certainly true, yeah. You have to be used to working in different places and using different IT systems, different logins and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. So things that have sort of come up in the past. So flexibility, as you mentioned, an opportunity to try out different practices. You can earn more as a locum, particularly when there are more locum shifts than there are locums. It's a bit supply and demand, so you can demand a premium for your service. You can sort of work out. So again, as a locum, you're self-employed, so you can be clever with your tax when you're a locum, and that can be helpful. Generally, less paperwork, and as you said, that the sort of ongoing tricky things with some patients, you can tend to avoid because you're not around for long enough. Locum organizer, which is something we can talk about later, is a really helpful tool that can help you organize yourself when you're a locum. So yeah, so those are some of the advantages. In terms of disadvantages, COVID was a really interesting thing actually for locums. So generally, if you're a locum, the summer is your best time ever because everyone wants to go on holiday and all practices in Devon are looking for locums. However, because of COVID, everyone's holidays got cancelled, and suddenly there was a pool of locums and no practices wanted a locum. So it's really interesting. So doing this talk year on year, there was certainly a year of people who no one became a locum because when they finished training, they knew that there were no locum jobs available because people weren't going on holiday. And I think there is a little bit of a hangover from that now, in that I think generally there are less locum shifts going than there used to be because of COVID and the uncertainty about going away. So I think these very strange once in a lifetime things can happen, but certainly if you were relying on income over a summer from doing locum shifts, and then suddenly all the practices said we don't need you anymore at short notice, there were people who actually were counting on money that never sort of came. You have to know about different computer systems. So EMIS system 1, it's good to be sort of acquainted with both of those. Are you comfortable working with one day, one the other day? A lack of continuity. So some people find that that's frustrating. You see an interesting patient and then you're never there again, so you don't know what happened. You don't get paid leave, so you're self-employed. So if you go on holiday, you don't get any money for it. You just have to sort of save up and work that out over the year. It is important to remember to take leave. I think generally people who are sort of career locums take a lot less leave than if you're salaried. You don't get any sick pay. So if you're unwell for any reason, and that can be unexpected in some cases, you don't get any sick pay. So I would really recommend, if you're locuming, to take out some insurance for that, so you can pay for insurance. So if you are sick, you do get an income still. You only get statutory maternity. So if you're planning to have children and you're a locum, you would only get the bare minimum of maternity pay. You have to be organised, so you do have to invoice practices and make sure you're up to date with your invoicing, and you have to submit a tax return. You have to deal with an accountant. You have to sort out your pension. And certainly as a locum, you never get any study leave unless you decide to take it for yourself. But again, that would be unpaid. I just put this picture in. So these are two of my friends who were locuming, and they both happened to be locuming in Budley. And so at lunchtime, they met up and had an ice cream together, which is a nice, unexpected thing about being a locum. other options. So you don't have to sort of be a slave to general practice and go with one of those three things. So there are many other things you can do. So these are some things. So out of hours we talked about. Certainly I know some people who do shifts in acute medicine, intermediate care. So there's some doctors that I know that are GPs who do sort of the liaison between hospital and AMU. Lots of doctors still work in the emergency department, particularly out of hours, minor surgery like I do. You can be a GPSI, so a GP with a special interest in lots of different things. So there's lots of dermatology gypsies out there. Education, of course, which is something some people enjoy. Expedition medicine, dive medicine. So in fact, one of the guys in that picture is now the head of the big dive centre, I forgot what it's called, DDRC in Plymouth. So he has now stopped being a GP and just does dive medicine. People who there are GPs, so civilian GPs who work at the commando base in Limpston, which some people enjoy. Lots of management-y type things that you can do as well. And obviously, in terms of pros and cons of all of those things, you get a chance to develop new skills. I think having a varied career helps you prevent you burning out. And I think actually, if you do other things, it sort of makes for a more interesting life. And if you are applying for jobs in the future, there's no reason why you need to stop all of those. You can carry on with all your extra things, and you can still be a GP at the same time. So that's a great thing about GP. You can work for 2 days, 3 days, 1 day even in general practice, and you can do other things as well. So here's some of the possible disadvantages, but I think with all of these things, it's a balance between the good and the bad bits, and actually you've got lots of options. I think that's a really important thing to think about that you might not have if you're in a sort of traditional hospital post. So new to practice fellowships. I don't know if Hannah Claxton is on the call. She was going to join at some point to talk about new to practice fellowships. So this is a relatively new initiative. So this is for GPs who've qualified in the last 2 years. It's organised by Devon Training Hub, and they essentially pay you the same as what you'd earn as a salaried doctor for 1 session a week to sort of aid your career development. So I would really, really, really encourage you to think about applying for this. So essentially it's a paid session a week to help you develop as a GP. And you get paid more or less the same as you would as a salaried doctor. So if you want to find out more about that, I think Hannah may join later and tell you a bit more about it. But if you go on Devon Training Hub website, there's lots more about new to practice fellowships and how to apply for that. And actually, the person in charge of it did a talk to the ST3s last year, which I recorded. So if you just go on YouTube and type in Exeter GP VTS, there's about a 20-minute talk by Tracy, who's a lady who organises new to practice fellowships, talking all about them. Yeah, and it's something that I would sort of really encourage you to sort of engage with and think about if you're coming out at the end of training soon, because it's one of those things that sort of seems a bit too good to be true, really. It's you get paid and it's just there to support your development as a new GP. So really worth considering if you are finishing this.
Can I ask quickly? Is that for kind of specific practices that have signed up to do it, or
no? No. So you have to have a contract with a GP practice. So you can't. I don't think you can do it if you're locuming. But if you are a salaried doctor, and you have got I think the practice just has to sign a form to say, yes, we agree that this is something that is worthwhile doing. So I think the practice sort of has to sign on a form to say, yeah, that's okay. But it doesn't have to be. There aren't sort of approved practices, so you don't get placed somewhere. It's something that you find yourself a GP job, and then you can apply for the New to Practice Fellowship, and it's pretty straightforward. I don't think anyone ever gets turned down for it, and you can decide to do that as part of the sessions you've agreed with your practice, or most people do it as an extra session. So they might choose to do 5 sessions as a salaried doctor, and then an extra one which would be their New to Practice Fellowship thing. So Emily,
sorry, this might be something to ask Hannah when she joins later, but do you know, is it I'm planning on applying for it in May. Do you have a set day of, like a half day of the week that everyone does the New to Practice Fellowship, or is it you just do it in your own time? You set half day a week.
So I think, so they have various things on, not every week. So they have some small group things and talks, and I don't think they're necessarily always on the same day.
Okay.
So it's just worth thinking about with your practice about whether they have any sort of flexibility. I think a lot of it can be self-directed as well. So the guys at our practice are doing sort of quality improvement projects, but they're doing things within the practice. So I think there's a degree of flexibility there. I think there's a few, maybe like 1 or 2 sessions a term, which are like on a Thursday morning or something, which are fixed, and that's when sort of invited speakers will come in and talk to you about things. But I don't think it's mandatory actually, even that you have to attend every one of those. So yeah, it sort of seems like a really good thing. Claire.
Yeah, thank you.
Claire?
Hi, yeah. Is there certain like intake, so you can only apply at certain times for certain
I think you can apply anytime
for it, or
I think you can apply anytime, because obviously, you know, everybody finishes at a different time nowadays. You know, it's gone are the days where it's sort of suddenly you get 30 new GPs in August. I think, I don't know if there might be sort of a couple of intakes a year, maybe a February and an August one, but you can certainly apply at any time. And I think it lasts for 2 years. So from the day you start, it lasts for, you get this extra funding for a session for 2 years. I think you can actually apply, I think it's any time within the first year or 18 months of qualifying. So even if you don't apply initially, you can go back, as long as you're still counted as a newly qualified GP. You can go back and do it. If you're thinking about it, honestly, it might well be worth you just watching the short video about it, because I'm maybe misremembering things. I think most of what I've said is accurate, but do have a look at that video if you're thinking about it. Cool. So yeah. So support going forward. So this is super important, and I think sort of thinking about this now about making sure, and I'm sure you guys have formed sort of friendships when you've been revising for your exams or in training over the years, but really important that you have a support group around you for when you finish training, because you don't get the sort of weekly catch-up that you get when you're a trainee. So I think you've had talks of, or some of you will have had talks about balance groups. Hopefully that's not just sort of gobbledygook for you. So balance groups are where you meet regularly with your peers to discuss cases or just have dinner or whatever. There is a mentorship scheme through the RCGP. So a lot of you said about whether you should continue to pay your RCGP subscription when you finish, and there are some advantages to being an RCGP member. So they do have a mentoring scheme where you can You can sort of buddy up with other GPs. I think the New to Practice Fellowship actually have started doing that as well. So you can, get some mentoring support through that as well. They also ran or still running a sort of first 5 scheme where they put on, this is the RCGP, they put on regular sort of talks and events that you can go to, and will sort of hook you up with other newly qualified GPs should you wish. And the training hub, which is who do the New to Practice Fellowship, is a good resource as well. So worth thinking about that before you finish training, about what are your needs going forward in terms of what are the things that you'll miss about being a trainee, and how do you sort of keep, make sure you keep in touch with the people that you train with, and make sure you have access to support when you need it, because when you start as a GP, it can feel difficult. So really important that you've got people you can talk to. And obviously we, as a sort of training scheme, we it's not you finish training and then we'll never speak to you again. So we are around, and we're all, or many of us are experienced GPs. So if you are struggling just because you've finished training, we're still here. So some tips. So this is my biggest tip actually, is don't worry. So the Devon is growing. In fact, Exeter is apparently the 5th, I found this out in the last couple of weeks, the 5th fastest growing city in the UK. So the population of Exeter is increasing. And when the population increases, they need more GPs. So there are lots and lots of jobs around. Don't rush into things. So make sure you sort of think about it before you accept a partnership in a practice that is not right for you. Don't worry about finding a job. There will be jobs for you. There are some fees at the end of GP training. So also on the VTS YouTube channel, there's a video called How to CCT, which is done by one of the newly qualified GPs. And again, I would recommend you watching that. And it goes through sort of what you need to know at the end of training. It's only, again, a very short video. And there are some fees associated with CCT basically. So worth sort of making sure that's not too much of a surprise for you. Important to make sure you've got your CCT certificate. I know it sounds daft, but you do need to make sure all your paperwork is in order before you start work as a GP, and make sure your indemnity is up to speed. And you can't start work before you've got those 2 things. So you do have to make sure they're in place before you take on locum work. So just be organised before you start. You also need to be on the performers list as well, and you should get given instructions on how to get on the performers list towards the end of training. That should automatically get sent to you. Appraisal. So this is essentially the GP equivalent of ARCP. So every year you have to have an appraisal. So you meet with another GP who is an appraiser. And there are certain bits and pieces that you are expected to do. So things like mandatory training, you are expected, even as a grown-up GP, to do some reflection, and also make sure you're keeping up to date with things. So you're continuing to keep up to date and going to meetings or going on a red whale course, or making sure that you're continuing with your professional development, even when you start as a GP. So just to be aware of that. Actually, appraisal has got a lot more straightforward since COVID. It used to be a many page form that you had to do, and actually it's been simplified a lot since COVID. And I suspect that it will never go back to what it used to be, which was filling in a 30-page sort of PDF document. Which it felt a bit painful at times. Yeah, so if you're planning on locuming, then have a look into Locum Organizer. It's a good piece of software, and will help you get organised if you do decide to be a locum. In terms of jobs, so this might be something to think about. So where do you find a job? So I would say first thing to do is talk to your trainer. There may be jobs close to where you are training at the moment, or even in the practice you're training at. So worth asking around, if you like where you're working, of course. If you don't, then I wouldn't do that. The Devon LMC website. So this is the first place I would really look for a job. So if you just type in Devon LMC and GP jobs, generally most GP jobs in Devon get advertised on there, and the reason they get advertised on there, it's free for the practices to advertise there. If you take out an advert in the BMJ, I think it's about £2,000, but on the LMC website it's free. So I would say most GP jobs go on the LMC website, so that is a place to look. BMJ, yeah, so if you want to work further away, then you might look at the BMJ, and there are jobs advertised on the RCGP website. I would steer you towards the LMC website, though. I think that's a really good place to look for jobs. And word of mouth and asking around is a really important thing as well, particularly if there's a practice that you feel like you might want to work at. Even if there are no jobs advertised at the moment, send the practice manager an email, and there's no harm in even sending your CV and say, if you have any vacancies coming up or need a locum, then you'd like to be considered for that. No practice would ever sort of turn their nose up at that. I think that would be a worthwhile thing to do if you've got a very specific area you'd like to work in, sort of close to home or whatever. I think we might do a separate talk on this later in the year, and there's also a recorded talk from last year about how to write a CV, and things like doing a cover letter. So generally, if you apply for a job, you have to do a CV. And with that goes a cover letter. And before I sort of finished training, I had no idea what those things. I knew what a CV was, obviously, but I didn't know what a cover letter was or how that should look. And then I think this is an important thing. So, sort of, when you're looking at jobs, how do you sort of compare them? And I think naturally, the first thing when you're looking at GP salaried jobs, particularly, the first thing you're drawn to is how much am I going to get paid? And I don't necessarily think that looking at just pay is a good idea and a good way to sort of select what you're going to do long term. I would say in general, places with fewer GPs, hence possibly more work, are able to pay you more than places where your workload may be smaller because they're better staffed. So do bear that in mind in terms of pay does not necessarily equal quality of life. So things that I would ask, so do you have a list? So if you're a salaried doctor, do you have a patient list? And if you do, how big is that? So asking about your list size per session is important. Will you be expected to do duty when you're there? How much annual leave do you get? Do you get study leave? Do you get any time to do admin? So if you do have a patient list, obviously there's associated paperwork and things with that. So are you expected to do that after all the patients have gone at 6:30 in the evening, or do you get time in the day to do that? Continuing education. So is there anything going on in the practice? So do they have regular teaching sessions or a huddle or anything like that, where you can sort of continue to learn even though you've finished? Are you offered mentorship? So some practices will hook you up with a more experienced GP to be your mentor for the first few years of qualifying. Certainly all our new doctors get a mentor, and you get to meet with them every month to sort of catch up and make sure everything's okay. Does the practice meet and have coffee? All things like this are really important in terms of your quality of life. Are you stuck in a little cupboard doing your patients and you never see another soul until you leave? Or is it a sociable place where you can meet with other people and have coffee? COVID dependent, I suppose. Does your practice do extended hours? So would you be expected as part of your role to contribute to early mornings or evening work, or even work at the weekend? And would that attract a premium in terms of your pay if you're expected to do a Saturday morning here or there? If you're interested, obviously important to ask about whether in the future there may be partnership opportunities, if that's something you consider in the future. And then ask about things like maternity and sick pay. And there is the BMA have actually produced a model contract, which is a sort of recommended terms and conditions for salaried doctors. So asking about does the practice follow the BMA model contract, which has got things in like sick leave and maternity pay and all of that kind of thing, and the sort of maximum amount of work and hours you should be doing day on day. So that would be something that would be worth looking at. And again, it's when you're in training and you've worked for a trust or whatever, you don't really have to think about any of these things. But when you're working in general practice, not every practice is the same. So asking about before you sign on the dotted line, can you look at your contract and whether how that compares with the BMA model contract is really important, just to make sure you're getting a fair deal, really. Who to ask? So I would say the first place would be if you know people, so current doctors at the practice. So if you can, it doesn't have to be any of the partners. In fact, probably better if it's not the partners, chat to people who work there already. Do they like their job? That's probably the most important thing, really. Are the people who work there already happy? Do you know trainees that have been through the practice? So they can often provide really valuable insight about how the practice runs and what the doctors are like that work there. So and you guys will probably have covered most of the practices in Devon between you over your training. So that's a really important resource. Obviously your friends, talk to them. They may know stuff, and friends of friends. It's a small world, as the world of general practice, and generally you can find somebody who knows a bit about a practice before you go to work there. And then finally, probably speaking to the practice manager about the practice. And most practices have something called a managing partner. So there will be a partner who sort of deals with recruitment and HR and all that kind of stuff. And they're often a really good person to talk to if you're considering applying for a job. Any questions on sort of that and what I've covered so far?
Do most people, once they've signed up to a partnership, do most people stay in kind of one partnership for the rest of their career, or do people switch and kind of?
I would say, so I think traditionally partnerships have been sort of thought of as, because you sort of, some partnerships you sort of pay into and you've got that sort of financial investment in a place. I think partnerships used to be sort of considered like marriages, and you know, as we all know, not every marriage is forever, and so I do think people do move around actually a lot more than they used to. It's actually not that difficult to get out of a partnership. You generally have to give a little bit more notice. So generally it's sort of 6 months notice if you want to resign from a partnership, but you can resign and you can move somewhere else. You're not as tied in as I think a lot of people first think. You know, we've certainly had partners that have moved to different parts of the country or decide that they're sort of at the end of their career and they want to wind down a bit, and they've gone from being a partner to a salaried doctor, and generally it's been pretty smooth and straightforward. So I would say partners would generally stay in a practice longer than the average salaried doctor, because you are a little bit more committed. But in terms of are you there from whatever the age of 30 until you retire. No, you're not, and you don't have to be at all. And the scope for changing, so the scope for changing the number of sessions you do, and you can become a salaried doctor even in the same place you're a partner, and you can move to a different partnership if you want to. So you're not sort of wedded there for the rest of your career at all.
Similarly, for salaried doctors, I mean, are the contracts, do they tend to kind of rolling contracts, or, you know, how long do people tend to stay in a salaried position? Because I suspect most people would kind of, well, maybe be a salaried GP before becoming a partner.
Again, I think it's very variable. So, so some people will. I mean, I know salaried doctors that have been in the same practice for sort of 20 or 30 years, and they've just looked at partnership and thought, this, you know, I really like this practice, but actually because of whatever family reasons, or they've got exciting hobbies or whatever, that more sort of regular 8:30 till 6, 3 days a week, and not having to worry about anything else and getting a set salary just really suits them. And I think some people will stay in the same job as a salaried doctor for many years. Equally, generally, I think salaried doctors have a sort of 3-month notice period. So if you are somewhere that you don't enjoy, or you want to move a different part of the country, or your personal circumstances change, or whatever, really, you know, it's like any job. You can give your notice and change. So it's different for everybody. I mean, there isn't. I think you just have to do what's right for you, really. I don't think being a salaried doctor is right for everybody. I don't think being a partner is right for everybody. But I would sort of sway away from the traditional approach of, if you're newly qualified, you become a salaried doctor, and then you must at some point become a partner, because otherwise you've not made it as a proper GP. I don't think that's true at all. And generally, you know, you're seeing the same patients, and often you see the same number of patients, whether you're a salaried doctor or a partner, and increasingly salaried doctors have their own patient lists. So I think you just choose what's right for you, really, and the scope over your career to be lots of different things, and you're not stuck in one role for longer than you ever want to be. So lots of flexibility. Nothing else. I shall move on. CVs, so possibly something that you've not had to think about for potentially many years if you've been doing GP training, and often you don't need to do this when you're in hospital either. So make it concise. Again, there is a talk on the YouTube channel about how to write a good CV. Make it concise. No one cares about your SATs results when you're in year 9. Have to do a covering letter, and again, there's lots of guidance on how to do that. I've done a lot of interviews and employed a lot of salaried doctors, and the ones that stand out are the ones that are sort of got a bit of personal stuff about you. So it's fine to write about your interests and your hobbies and what you want to do in the future and all that kind of stuff. It's much more interesting reading those than the ones which are just a list of achievements and audits and things. Interviews. So again, there's a separate talk on this on the YouTube channel, and I think we may even do a session for you guys that are around later in the year about interviews. So just some basics. I would make contact with the practice. So the most powerful thing you can do if you're applying for a job is not to just submit an application, but there's often contact details. In fact, on every if you go on the LMC website, on every single one of the jobs on there, there's a contact details for a partner or the practice manager. So I would make contact with them and arrange to have an informal chat. find out about the practice, and we talked about speaking to people who'd worked there before, and learn a bit about the practice and the population that you'll be serving when you work there. And these are all things that if you've done that when you go to interview and you show you've sort of done your research, they're all things that people look upon very favourably. Don't panic. Yeah, GP interviews are not scary. Generally, the composition ratios are not massively stacked against you, and there are lots of jobs out there. So I've never heard of a scary GP interview in my entire life. Common things that get asked. So obviously, what attracted you to the role? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And then sort of things like, how would you manage if there was an angry patient in the reception? What would you do? They're things that are very commonly asked. So that is the end.